The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1, Titus Groan. First, Repercussions. Unable to reconcile the heroism of Steerpike's rescue with his face as she had seen it beyond the window before she fell, Fuchsia began to treat the youth with less and less assurance. She began to admire his ingenuity, his devilry, his gift of speech, which she found so difficult but which was for him so simple. She admired his cold efficiency, and she hated it. She wondered at his quickness, his self-assurance. The more she saw of him, the more she felt impelled to recognize in him a nature at once more astute and swift than her own. At night, his pale face with its closely set eyes would keep appearing before her, and when she awoke, she would remember with a start how he had saved their lives. Fuchsia could not make him out. She watched him carefully. Somehow he had become one of the personalities of the castle's central life. He had been insinuating his presence on all who mattered with such subtlety that when he leapt dramatically to the force by rescuing the family from the burning library, it was as though that deed of valor were all that had been needed to propel him to the forefront of the picture. He still lived at the Prune Squaller's, but was making secret plans for moving into a long, spacious room with a window that let in the morning sun. It lay on the same floor as the aunt's in the south wing. There was really very little reason for him to stay with the doctor, who did not seem sufficiently aware of the new status he had acquired, and whose questions regarding the way he, Steerpike, had found the pine tree, already felled and lopped for the rescue, and various other details, though not difficult to answer, for he had prepared his replies to any of the possible questions he might be faced with, were, nevertheless, pertinent. The doctor had had his uses. He had proved a valuable stepping stone, but it was time to take up a room, or a suite of rooms, in the castle proper, where knowledge of what was going on would come more easily. Prune Squalor, ever since the burning, had been, for him, strangely voiceless. When he spoke, it was in the same high, thin, rapid way, but for a great part of each day he would lie back in his chair in the sitting-room, smiling incessantly at everyone who caught his eye, his teeth displayed as uncompromisingly as ever before, but with something more cognitive about the great, magnified eyes that swam beneath the thick lenses of his spectacles. Irma, who since the fire had been strapped in her bed, and who was having about half a pint of blood removed on alternate Tuesdays, was now allowed downstairs in the afternoons, where she sat dejectedly and tore up sheets of calico which were brought to her chair-side every morning. For hours on end she would continue with this noisy, wasteful and monotonous soporific, brooding the while upon the fact that she was no lady. Mrs. Slagg was still very ill. Fuchsia did all she could for her, moving the nurse's bed into her own room, for the old woman had become very frightened of the dark, which she now associated with smoke. Titus seemed to be the one least affected by the burning. His eyes remained bloodshot for some time afterwards, but the only other result was a severe cold, and Prune Squalor took the infant over to his own house for its duration. Old Sourdust's bones had been removed from the marble table among the charred remains of woodwork and books. Flay, who had been assigned the mission of collecting the dead librarian's remains and of returning with them to the servants' quadrangle, where a coffin was being constructed from old boxes, found it difficult to handle the charred skeleton. The head had become a bit loose, and Flay, after scratching his own skull for a long while, at last decided that the only thing to do would be to carry the rattling relic in his arms, as though he were carrying a baby. This was both more respectful and lessened the danger of disarticulation or breakage. On that particular evening, as he returned through the woods, the rain had fallen heavily before he reached the fringe of the trees, and by the time he was halfway across the wasteland which divided the pines from Gormenghast, the rain was streaming over the bones and skull in his arms and bubbling in the eye sockets. Flay's clothes were soaking, and the water squelched in his boots. As he neared the castle, the light had become so obscured by the downpour that he could not see more than a few paces ahead. Suddenly, a sound immediately behind him caused him to start, but before he was able to turn, a sharp pain at the back of his head filled him with sickness, and sinking gradually to his knees, he loosed the skeleton from his arms and sank in a stupor upon the bubbling ground. How many hours or minutes he had been lying there he could not know, but when he recovered consciousness, the rain was still falling heavily. He raised his great rough hand to the back of his head, where he discovered a swelling the size of a duck's egg. Swift jabs of pain darted through his brain from side to side. All at once he remembered the skeleton and got dizzily to his knees. His eyes were still misted, but he saw the wavering outline of the bones. But when a few moments later his eyes had cleared, he found that the head was missing.